All right. Last period, if you'll remember, we examined the probable relationships between the first three of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and arrived at the position which most scholars accept today, which is known as the four-source theory. To refresh your memories, we saw that that looks like a bow tie. You have four sources across the top. M, special source for Matthew. Q, a source no longer existing, but we can reconstruct it based upon what's common in Matthew and Luke only, nowhere else. Mark, from whence Matthew and Luke got the bulk of their material, and a special source for passages that appear only in Luke, which we call L. This we recall, having gone over last time, and we looked at Q. Surely it was a written document. We can infer that because the wording is identical in many cases. When you look at the passages that appear only in Matthew and Luke, both, and that's where we come up with the idea of Q. They must have had some source available to the two of them. Probably written in Palestine, is only a collection of Jesus' sayings. There aren't any passages other than sayings that appear in Matthew and Luke only. A written document, only sayings. It must have been written late enough that Mark wound up not knowing about it or not having a copy, but early enough that it could have reached both Matthew and Luke. So what the heck, we'll say 50 A.D. as a probable time of writing. And if we have to pick a place, more likely than not, Palestine is where it would have been compiled. M and L we know less about because we can't compare them with anything else. M is a hypothesized source to explain why there are certain passages that appear only in Matthew's Gospel. And L is a hypothesized source to explain why there are certain passages that appear only in Luke's Gospel. Were these written sources, as we know Mark was and as we think Q was? Who can say? Because we can't make any comparisons of a passage that only appears in Matthew or a passage that only appears in Mark. So that has to remain an open question. Was it a single source from whence Matthew got the passages that only appear in him, or a single source that Luke got the passages that only appear in him? Again, we don't know. Was it oral? These have to remain open, but it does seem to be the case that Matthew did know certain traditions about Jesus that do not appear in the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, or Luke. And same with Luke. There are certain traditions that appear in him that do not appear elsewhere. And so we hypothesize some kind of source that he came from, the nature of which has to remain pretty much an open question. So we examined it fairly well, about as well as we can, the nature of Q, the nature of M, and the nature of L. But one thing we did not talk about last time is why we think Mark has to have been written first and the other Gospels, Matthew and Luke, copied from him. If there are certain passages that appear in all three of these Gospels, then why should we assume Mark wrote first? Couldn't it have been the case that Matthew wrote first and Mark and Luke both had copies of him? You'd still wind up with a passage being in all three of those Gospels. Or Luke could have written first and Matthew and Luke, or any number of other possibilities. Matthew could have written, Luke could have written, Mark could have had a copy of Luke. You'd still wind up with the same passage in all three Gospels. So why should we necessarily opt for this relationship instead of all these other possibilities? By the way, I mentioned last time, there's a minority of scholars who defend an alternative explanation for the relationships among the Gospels. That alternative explanation is the Wiesbach hypothesis, and it posits that Matthew wrote first, that Luke had a copy of Matthew, and that Mark had a copy not just of Luke, but of both Matthew and Luke. Well, there again, you're going to wind up with passages in all three Gospels, and that's explicable in terms of a theory like that. So why is it that, I don't know, 85 to 90% of scholars opt for this instead of that? Well, I think there's very good reasons why scholars think that Mark wrote his Gospel prior to Matthew and Luke. This is the question of Markan priority. Priority not in the sense of this event is more important than that one, so I'm going to give it higher priority. Priority here means priorness, having been written first. How do we go about establishing Markan priority? Well, there's various arguments for why Mark probably wrote his Gospel first. One of them is an argument that we can call shared Markan material. Matthew's Gospel contains 28 chapters. Luke's Gospel has 24 chapters, but actually they're slightly longer than Matthew's, so consequently his completed Gospel is a bit longer. And Mark's Gospel is only 16 chapters. It's the shortest of the three Gospels. If you count them up, you'll discover there are 609 verses in those 16 chapters of Mark's Gospel. And all kinds of things, of course, are related in Mark's Gospel. Stilling the storm, healing the paralytic, healing the leper, some parables, narrative, etc. If you compare Mark's Gospel to the Gospel of Matthew and of Luke, what you wind up discovering is, out of those 609 verses, almost all of them appear either in Matthew or in Luke or in both. There's very little of Mark that does not appear in Matthew or in Luke. In fact, there are only 30 verses out of the 609 that don't appear either in Matthew or in Luke. Now that in itself doesn't prove that Mark wrote first, because after all, if Mark wrote last and had Matthew and Luke in front of him, he could say, oh well, he simply got everything from Matthew and Luke, plus he threw in 30 verses that they didn't have. But it's when you stop and look at what those 30 verses are that this becomes an argument for why Mark wrote first. What are the sorts of things that you find among these 30 verses? Well, you have the statement that Jesus' family went and tried to take Jesus and remove him because they had been persuaded or had been told that Jesus was crazy. Are you familiar with that passage in Mark? Oh, well, I can't pull the mind right offhand exactly where it's at. I'm sorry for that. Another one is the healing of, I believe it's blind Bartimaeus. Not Bartimaeus, it's the other blind man. Here it is. It's Mark chapter 8, verse 22. They came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" And the man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Then he sent him away to his home, saying, "Do not even go into the village." Now there we've got a handful of verses. These are among the 30 verses that are found only in Mark's Gospel. They're not found in Matthew and Luke. It's possible that Mark wrote later and had Matthew and Luke in front of him and added this passage. But it's more probable, perhaps, that Matthew and Luke opted, both of them, to leave that passage out. Why would they choose to leave that passage out? Because he had to try twice to get the guy healed, right? We're told Jesus did his ministrations and said, "Can you see anything?" The man said, "Well, I see something, but it looks like trees walking." Jesus didn't do it right the first time. He had to make a second attempt. Now that's not especially flattering to Jesus.
He was human.
Excuse me?
He was human.
He was human. Did you notice also that he used saliva? Which is not the most pleasant thing. There's another healing miracle among the 30 verses. I'm trying to remember where it is in Mark, and I apologize that my memory skips me on this, where Jesus, to heal someone, I believe he was deaf and dumb. He takes some of his own spit and puts it on the guy's tongue. And then I believe, doesn't he mix mud and put it in the guy's ears? I don't know about you, I'm a little squeamish about other people spit on my tongue. So, these are not especially complimentary passages to Jesus. So, we can come up with an explanation for why these 30 verses were left out by Matthew and Luke. Nobody can come up with a very good reason for why Mark would have added them if he had had Matthew and Luke in front of him. So the more probable conclusion is that Mark wrote first and Matthew and Luke used him, and in this instance opted to leave out those 30 verses because they were not very complimentary. Now that's one argument for why Mark wrote his gospel first and Matthew and Luke used him. That's the argument of shared Markan material. There are 30 verses out of the 609 verses in Mark, not found in Matthew and Luke, and we can explain why we got like that. A second argument has to do with omissions by Mark. The supporters of the grease spot hypothesis who say that Mark, when he wrote, had a copy of Matthew and a copy of Luke in front of him, have a very hard time, it seems to me, coming up with a good reason why Mark's gospel is so short. If Mark wrote last, he would have had to have left out an awful lot of stuff that shows up in Matthew's gospel and in Luke's gospel. In fact, we know exactly what he would have to have left out. What he left out was all of them, because him, by definition, is the passages that appear only in Matthew. He would have had to have left out all of L, because L, by definition, is all the passages that only appear in Luke, and he would have had to have left out all of Q, Because Q, by definition, is those passages that only appear in Matthew and Luke. Consequently, M, Q, and L, all three, are sets of passages that only appear outside Mark's gospel. Now, if Mark were writing with a copy of Matthew and Luke in front of him, he knew about these passages. And yet he chose to leave all of that stuff out. Well, what sorts of stuff are we talking about here? Can anybody remember any passage that's included in M? The Christmas stories. In fact, we saw there were two versions. One that Matthew was aware of and one that Luke was aware of. So the Christmas stories from M and L both, Mark would have had to have decided to leave out. If you look at the first verses of Mark's Gospel, bang, he starts right there with Jesus full grown, starting his public ministry. Another M passage is laborers in the vineyard. That's the parable about hiring the guys at 6 a.m., 9 a.m., noon, 3 a.m., 5. The weeds among the wheat, the parable of the pearl of great price, so on and so on. The panorama of the Last Judgment, where all of humanity is before Jesus on his throne, and he separates the sheep on the right and goats on the left. All of that is M stuff, and Mark would have had to have come up with a good reason for leaving it all out. How about L material? Well, we know L had its own Christmas story, which Luke has. But in addition to that, there's other passages that appear only in the Gospel. I mentioned a couple last time. The parable of the prodigal son and the parable of the Good Samaritan. If you were Mark and you had those two parables in front of you, would you have included those? I mean, to my mind, those are kind of the greatest of all the parables. That pair. And what about Q? Where do you find in Q? The Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer appears in Matthew chapter 6 and Luke chapter 11 and nowhere else. It's a Q passage. Mark would have had to have come across the Lord's Prayer if he had Matthew and or Luke in front of him and decided not to include it. That seems very strange. Lord's Prayer, heck, what about the Sermon on the Mount? The Sermon on the Mount is Q. Does not love your enemies, turn the cheek, all that stuff. Sermon on the Mount. I, for one, cannot think of any reasonable explanation for why Mark would have left out all this incredibly juicy stuff that Jesus said he did, if he had Matthew or Luke or both in front of him. But if he didn't, if he wrote first, then you can see why Matthew from Q and from M would have supplemented Mark, and why Luke from L and from Q would have supplemented Mark. And so you wind up with enlarged editions of Mark, in a way, which is not a bad description for Matthew and Luke.
There would be a good chance that some of this material is lost.
The Mark room? I suppose theoretically Mark's gospel originally may have come all the way down to here, and somebody came along later and edited it, and it only wound up half as long. And then you have to hypothesize that all the copies of the original gospel were destroyed, and only copies of the abridgment were later disseminated. I suppose it's possible, but there's absolutely no evidence for it. So, what do you do? Well, it's not likely that the three knew each other. No, it's not likely that the three knew each other. So, if they didn't know each other, they wouldn't know that, they wouldn't know that theirs was going to be the last gospel available. It's going to be written. If you were Luke, and you weren't aware of Matthew, of course you got Mark in front of you, according to as far as you know, this is going to be it for communicating to your readers what there is to know about Jesus. Naturally, you're going to supplement Mark with all kinds of stuff that you're aware of. Parables of the Good Samaritan, parables about the Son, Sermon on the Mount, all that kind of stuff. Matthew would do the same thing, supplement Mark. But it's unlikely Matthew and Luke knew that the other one was writing the gospel. For one thing, they're, as far as we can tell, from approximately the same period. Matthew's usually dated to 85, and Luke is usually dated to around 90. And then you've got a similar kind of difficulty here. If you were Luke, would you have left out some of the things that Matthew has? If you were Matthew, would you have left out prodigal son, good Samaritan? It just seems unlikely. So there's a second argument. If Mark were writing last and had either Matthew or Luke or both, why did he compress the gospel down to such an extent that all of what we would all pretty much agree are some of the most significant things that Jesus ever said be left out? A third argument for Markan priority is the order in which passages appear in the gospel. If you look at a synopsis, where you've got the three gospels printed side by side, you see, and I'm deliberately going to leave out M, Q, and L material here. We're only going to talk about passages that appear in at least two of these synopses. You'll have a passage that appears in all three of the gospels. Let's say healing of the paralytic. And then you have another one that appears in all three, healing of the leper. Pretty soon you come across something that appears only in Matthew or Mark. And then it might resume again with all three of them in order. Pretty soon you'll come across a passage where Matthew has omitted what Mark and Luke both have. They might go back together for a while. Pretty soon they'll deviate, etc. There are these deviations in the order. Sometimes it's a case of Matthew or Luke leaving out something altogether. Sometimes it's a case of one or the other moving a passage to a different spot in the gospel narrative. Either way, there are these differences in the order in which the events are related. Well, what you discover when you stop and analyze these changes in order is whenever Matthew deviates from Mark's order, that is, whenever he leaves out something that Mark has, or he moves something down either later or above it, Luke will still have that same passage in the same spot that Luke has. And the same thing is true on the other side. Whenever Luke leaves out or moves a passage from where it is in Mark, Matthew will still have it exactly where Mark is. So when Matthew deviates from Mark, Luke follows Mark. And when Luke deviates from Mark, Matthew follows Mark. Consequently, Mark's order is the common denominator between the other two Gospels. Consequently, both of them must have had Mark's order in front of them. You see this argument? It's the argument from order. When you look at the order in which the peripheries are arranged, you can tell from the deviations. When Matthew deviates, Luke follows Mark, and when Luke deviates, Matthew follows Mark. Therefore, Mark is the common denominator and must have been the common source. for Matthew and Luke. A fourth argument for the priority of Mark, a fourth proof that he wrote prior to the other two and was used by them as a source, is an argument that we can refer to as narrative roughnesses. Now this one's a little tricky. I think it's best explained by giving an example. We know that one of the passages that appears both in Mark and in Luke is the rejection of Nazareth. Remember that story? Jesus goes back to his hometown after having become famous and does a little preaching. At first they're kind of taken with him, but when he starts to say things they don't like, they get angry at him. They march him to the brow of the hill intending to throw him off, but instead he walks through their midst and leaves. That's the rejection of Nazareth. Well, in Mark's gospel, fairly early in the gospel, Mark presents 2 or 3 miracles that Jesus does at a city called Capernaum. These include the healing of the paralytic, the healing of the leper, the withered hand, and so on. We can refer to these as the Capernaum miracles, the miracles that Jesus does in Capernaum. It's only after Jesus does these miracles in Capernaum that several items later, Mark has the rejection at Nazareth. And when you read Mark's account of the rejection at Nazareth, you discover that reference is made to the miracles that were done at Capernaum. Jesus says to the Nazarene citizens, "No doubt you will say to me, 'Do among you miracles such as you did at Capernaum.'" Now that makes perfect sense. He's already done the miracles at Capernaum. For Jesus to refer back to them does not violate any principles. But take a look at what Luke does. Luke switches the order of these. Luke has the Capernaum miracles down here, and he's got the rejection of Nazareth up here. But once again, reference is made to the Capernaum miracles. Does that make sense? Jesus says, "No doubt you will say to me, 'Do among you miracles such as I did at Capernaum.'" Wait a minute, he hasn't done any at Capernaum yet, because Luke has those later on in the narrative. But Luke still has the sentence, "Do miracles such as you did at Capernaum." The sentence makes perfect sense in Mark. It doesn't make any sense in Luke. Where did Luke get that sentence? From Mark. See what I mean? That's a narrative roughness in Luke. And it indicates that Luke was using Mark as a source. And by simple oversight, failed to edit that sentence correctly. There's 3 or 4 instances of this. There's one more in Luke and a couple in Matthew. But this is what we mean by narrative roughness. Like, somehow, the alterations made to Mark by Matthew and Luke leave some kind of roughness that indicates that they were, in fact, altering Mark. One more argument for why Mark probably wrote first, and Matthew and Luke used him as a source. Improvements in style. Each of the 3 synoptic evangelists has his own particular style of writing. Luke is an exquisite rhetorician. He obviously was very well trained in the educational system of the times because he writes beautiful, long, flowing Greek sentences, never with any error of any kind. Matthew also writes good Greek. It's not as fancy. But Mark is pretty hopeless. Mark writes extremely bad Greek. I suppose in English he writes he writes intelligibly. You can figure out what he's saying in the original Greek. But you can see all these errors in it. It's like reading something written by a sixth grader. The sixth grader gets most of English right, but there's a few things that he hasn't learned yet, and so things are wrong.
That's good.
Right? Yeah, that's a good thing. Yeah. That's exactly the kind of error that Mark makes. Not only that, but you can tell that Mark does not think in Greek naturally. Greek is not his native language. It probably was Luke's native language, I'm guessing. You know how somebody who comes from a different country and then learns English, during the process of learning English, occasionally his original language will show through. Here's an example. Suppose that somebody moved here from Germany and he's just mastering English, getting pretty good, but still not totally correct. Suppose that he wants to say, hey, let's go to the movies. Well, first he thinks of it in German. And how do you say that in German? Ich will ins Kino gehen. I want to the movies to go. So the German says, hey, let's all to the movies to go. And he won't realize that he didn't say it exactly like in English, but he's thinking in terms of his original language. This is exactly what happens in Mark's Gospel. He's not thinking in Greek, he's thinking in another language, probably Aramaic. Aramaic was a common language among the peasant class in Jesus' day, and probably the language that Jesus himself learned in the home as an infant. It's where we get words like Abba, for father, or Golgotha, which is the place of the cross, the place of the skull where Jesus was crucified. Or mammon. You cannot serve both God and mammon. Mammon means possession. These are all instances of Aramaic words which have been retained in Mark's Gospel. But in addition to retaining a few words, there's about 7 or 8 words retained. He's also got these syntactical patterns of Aramaic. Well, you don't find these in Matthew and Luke. So now I ask you, is it more likely that Mark wrote crummy Greek and Matthew and Luke came along and cleaned it up? Or Matthew and Luke wrote elegant Greek and Mark deliberately mucked it up? It doesn't make any sense. It's much more likely that Mark wrote first and Matthew and Luke came along and cleaned up after him. So that's what we mean by this fifth argument, stylistic improvements. They not only clean up his syntax, they clean up his word choices too. Occasionally, Mark, presumably inadvertently, will choose words that are inappropriate in polite society, let's say. When you look at the equivalent words that Matthew and Luke have, they will choose acceptable equivalents of those words. An example is the word that's used for palate in the healing of the paralytic. Remember they tore open the rope that lowered him on a pallet? The word for palate in Mark, I can't recall. Yeah, that would be sort of something like that. In, I don't remember the Greek. Matthew changes it to the word kine, and Luke changes it to the Greek word kineion, both of which are okay in polite society. society. But the word that Mark chose, you just really don't say at a cocktail party. You know what I mean? So these are the sorts of stylistic improvements that are made. Well, any one of these arguments, I suppose you could possibly quibble with, but by the time you put all 5 of them together, that's a pretty serious indication, I think, that Mark is the one who wrote first. And so that explains why, of the 2 theories concerning gospel relationships among the synoptics, the 4-source and the Griesbach, probably 90% go with 4-source and 10% go with Griesbach. Now that was really finishing off last time, because last time we were talking about what were the relationships between the synoptic gospels. What I'd like to do this evening is discuss some of the types of criticism that are applied to the gospels by modern scholars. And in particular, there are 4 types of these I'd like to discuss. Text criticism, source criticism, form criticism, and redaction criticism. These are methods of interpreting or analyzing the Gospels. And of course, to some extent, they can be applied to any work of literature. All of these share the word criticism. In ordinary speech, criticism means pointing out a flaw. Oh, you're so critical. You point out so many flaws. That's not at all what the word means in the phrases. What it means is based on the Greek word krite, which means judgment. So we're just talking about analyzing. And it would actually be better if we said text analysis, source analysis, form analysis. It's established convention now to say criticism, so we'll stick with that. But that's what we mean, is analysis, not criticizing. Let's start with the first one, text criticism. Text analysis. Now you would assume that that means that you're going to have a text in front of you and you're going to analyze it, which would mean figure out what it says exactly. Like if you're in an English class, you all read the novel Moby Dick, and then you analyze it. You're analyzing a text. That's what you would think that this means, but it doesn't at all mean that. It's something much more fundamental. What text criticism means is establishing the original wording of a text. It is not difficult to obtain the original text of Moby Dick because we still have Melville's manuscripts. When it was published, there weren't more than a couple of mistakes in that printed edition. They were corrected in later editions. Go to a bookstore and buy Moby Dick and you got the original wording there. No problem. But that's a modern book. What we're talking about with the Gospels is writings that were 2,000 years ago and writings at a time when there were no printing presses. And it's a whole different situation back then than what it is nowadays. So establishing what it is that an author originally wrote can sometimes be very tricky. For one thing, we now have AD line, we now have approximately 5,000 manuscripts of the New Testament in Greek. MS, capital M, capital S, is a standard scholarly abbreviation for manuscript, and just another S on it, that's manuscript. We have approximately 5,000 manuscripts. Now, what do we mean by manuscript? Today, a manuscript means a work that I wrote that hasn't yet been published. If I went to a word processor and typed up a screenplay and I shipped it out to Hollywood, and it got accepted by Paramount, I would say, hey, they accepted my manuscript. That's not what we mean here. We're talking about it in the fundamental sense. Manu is the Latin word for hand. That's where we get like manufacture, made by hand and so on. And script, of course, means to write. So a manuscript is a handwritten document. Consequently, one prior to printing being available. So when was printing invented? Probably about 1450. I've checked several books. I've sometimes seen 1447, I've sometimes seen 1457. So what the heck, I give up, I'll go with 1450 because it's easy to remember anyway. Approximately 1450 AD, the printing press is invented. So that means that prior to printing, or, well, printing press, it took a while to spread around to everybody, so you still get some handwritten documents after 1450. But certainly by 1600, nobody bothers to handwrite anymore. It's much quicker and simpler to print. So from the beginning of the New Testament documents, the period 50 to 125, when they first came into existence, down to about 1600, we got 5,000 copies of all or part of the New Testament. Most of those are fragmentary. Most of those are not the complete New Testament. Well, if I laid out on this floor here all 5,000 pieces of the New Testament in Greek that we still have, I'm going to compare them and I will discover that they differ. At such and such a verse, one copy says such and such, and then I look at the same verse over here and it's got a different word in the middle of the sentence. How do I know which one Luke originally wrote, or John originally wrote? And then I look at the third spot and there's a third word. How do we go about deciding among these manuscripts which ones are to be preferred? Well, obviously, the earlier the better, right? Further back you can show a manuscript to go, the better off you are. That's because when you copy things by hand, errors are going to creep in. Isn't that true? Okay, your assignment for next week. I want you all to copy the Gospel of John by hand. Okay, can you do that? Sure, right. But if you did, and we came and compared, I wager we could find at least one little detail that was wrong in every single one of them. Its errors just naturally creep in. Let's suppose that here is the first copy of John. This is the evening when John finished writing John's Gospel, whoever John was. We already talked about that. And he puts the final period at the end of it, and he's ready to go. Now, obviously, there's going to be several people in his church who say, wow, that's great, John. I want a copy. Can I make a copy? And so you're going to wind up with several copies of John's Gospel. And then people will see this fellow's copy and say, that's great. Can I have a copy? You're going to wind up with more copies. And let's suppose that this guy got John's Gospel exactly right, except that right here, he made some little error in copying. what's going to happen when his friends copy that manuscript? They don't have this one, they got this one, they're going to make copies with that same error in that same spot, not knowing it's an error. And of course, when this guy copies it, he's going to make an error, let's say right here. So when people copy his, they're going to wind up reproducing both errors. And this guy is going to make another one. So that all the copies there is going to have another error. One of the ways that we can determine how far back a manuscript goes is we can reconstruct family trees of errors. You know, just like genealogy. You probably have a cousin somewhere who's fascinated by your family history, you know, is doing all this research on computer and stuff. You can do that with manuscripts. You can look at what are the family relationships among the errors and actually arrange a lot of these 5,000 manuscripts into some kind of order like that. And when you do that, you can automatically eliminate the latest level of manuscripts because they have the most errors in them. Another thing you can do is carbon-14 dating. You've heard of that with science. If you have something that's organic, remains of something organic, like paper made out of wood pulp, and let's say it's from 600 AD, well, you can take a tiny piece from one corner, subject it to certain chemical reactions in the laboratory, and depending upon how much the radioactivity in the carbon has died out, you can determine from when that tree died. And that will tell you the date at which the paper was made, and therefore presumably close to the date at which the manuscript was made. They've now got even fancier ones, potassium argon and stuff like that. So that's a possibility. You can use that for dating. All over the world. There is a fragment of John's Gospel at Perkins School of Theology in Dallas. It dates from like 200 years. There's a major manuscript collection in Ann Arbor, Michigan. There was a guy who became extremely wealthy from the automobile industry. His name was Free. And so one of the things that he decided to do with his millions that he made off of investing in Ford was create a building, and in it he housed a bunch of gospel manuscripts that he purchased from Egypt and all over the place. There are copies of the New Testament in Greek in Leningrad Museum. There's copies in a monastery on Mount Sinai, St. Catherine's Monastery. So they're all over the place. All the major museums and libraries in Europe. Well, the Bodleian Library in London has a great collection of weeklies. So they're all over the place. That would be a problem if we weren't living in the 20th century. But fortunately, any scholar anywhere can now gather together copies of almost all of these manuscripts. So we're in excellent shape as far as getting them all together for a single scholar to look at. Thanks to photocopies. I don't have to travel to Leningrad and London and everywhere else to compare all these manuscripts. Another way that you can date manuscripts is handwriting styles. Handwriting styles change over the centuries. I remember when I was a little boy, I was sitting on my grandfather's lap while he was seated at the kitchen table writing a letter. My grandfather came over from Germany, and so he learned how to read and write in Germany. And he was writing a letter to a relative of ours back in Germany. And I could still see what his handwriting looked like. He had the same name as me. I'm named after him. Paul Hahn. This is sort of the way that he would have signed his name. That's Paul. In other words, there were no curves. Where did you get that from? Well, that's the way that people wrote German back at the 1890s when he came over, when he learned German over in Germany. And he retained that way of writing German. It's not the way people write German nowadays. So if somebody 1,000 years from now comes across, and they're scrounging around in the 20th century, they dig up a copy of some letter that my grandfather wrote, they can look at the handwriting, and if they know how the handwriting styles have changed, they can say, that looks like it's from 1890 or so. And they'd be within a couple of decades of when it was actually written. So, handwriting styles are another way that you can date manuscripts. There's a whole science of handwriting styles. It's called paleography. Paleo means old. Paleontologists are the ones who study dinosaur bones. And grapho is Greek for to write, just like scripto is Latin for to write. Old writing, science of old writing. There are people who spend their whole lives analyzing when various handwriting styles were common. I remember when I first started teaching in the mid-70s, freshman girls would turn in research papers to me, and I noticed it was fashionable at that time to end your name with just an I and not an I-E. So Debbie would be Debbie with just the I, or Tammy would be T-A-M-M-I without the Y. And for some reason, they all put, instead of a dot above, they put a little heart. Can you imagine some archaeologists? Well, hopefully that they'll know 1,000 years from now that that was the style of writing in America by female freshmen in the 70s. They had manuscripts. Ultimately, our copies of the New Testament in Greek that are printed nowadays are based on, I would say, probably about 400 manuscripts that scholars have established as being the earliest and the best. Up to 200, basically you have fragments. You don't have any complete copies of the Gospels. I should say up to 300. I don't think there's any complete Gospels. But after 300, Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire, thanks to Constantine, who was an emperor and converted to Christianity. And Constantine commissioned 50 magnificent Bibles. He wanted them to be made not on papyrus, which is flimsy like paper made from a plant in Egypt. He wanted them made on calf skins so that they'd be permanent. And we still have some of these, and they are excellent texts, and they are complete. The Codex Vaticanus in the Vatican is a complete Bible in Greek, Old and New Testament, all in Greek. The Old Testament is translated from Hebrew to Greek. Codex Sinaiticus is one of these 50 Bibles that we commissioned. So our Greek texts of the New Testament nowadays are based upon these earliest and best manuscripts that we still have. The greatest living text critic, the greatest living practitioner of this art of establishing the original wording of the New Testament, is a professor at Princeton University. His name is Bruce Metzger. And in a book of his, I once came across a statement by him which said, in my opinion, 95% of the New Testament as we reproduce it today has got to be what was originally written. By Luke, by Matthew, whatever. I thought that was an interesting quote. Plus, he went on to say, the other 5% is all inconsequential little things. Instead of saying him, it says them, or something like that. And he pointed out that none of the 5% that's still not absolutely sure about contains any crucial doctrinal type of statements. So actually, we're in excellent shape as far as establishing the original wording of the New Testament, because we've got 5,000 copies in manuscript, and so much work has been done on it, we can feel confident about how secure the text is. When you compare that to other ancient works, you see just how well off we are. Take Aristotle, for example. We've got copies of the Old Testament that go all the way back, well, probably the earliest dates from 125 AD, and that's 3 verses from John's Gospel that were found in southern Egypt, and we saw that last time. What about Aristotle? Aristotle wrote his works in the 300s BC. The earliest still existing copies of any of Aristotle date from like 1300 AD. And that's a gap of 1,600 years between his original documents and his earliest copies that still exist. Plus, we've only got 30 copies of Aristotle. And really. So, I just want you to realize how lucky we are. Or perhaps providence. All right, now that's text criticism. Text criticism means establishing the original wording. Before you even start asking what does it mean, you have to figure out what did Luke originally write, or Paul originally write, or whatever. Once you've established what is the original wording of the text, then you can start analyzing it in the way we normally think of analysis. What does it mean? And one of the things you're going to want to do is figure out the sources. Hey, this is old hat. We can do this in 1 minute. Because source criticism means source analysis, analyzing the sources. And we just did it last period and the beginning of this period. We were analyzing what was the source for what else. And we saw the 4 source theory in M, Q, Mark, and L. If you'll recall, those of you who were here in the last series of lectures, we did source criticism of the Old Testament. Remember when we examined those first 2 chapters of Genesis? We figured out there were 2 different sources involved there. So, that's source criticism, and that we got a good grip on. That's just analyzing sources. Let's move on to the next one. Form criticism.